What if a baby forgotten in a New York subway became the turning point in an elderly woman's life? Margaret, a retired teacher, finds new purpose in caring for Logan, a child shrouded in mystery. Decades later, a tightly held secret and a medical crisis irrevocably alter their lives, revealing truths no one anticipated. Prepare for a story of abandonment, love, resilience, and family bonds that defy time and pain. Margaret lived in an apartment in the heart of Brooklyn, where every corner seemed touched by time but not by love. The walls, adorned with old paintings, bore witness to her solitude, and Charlie, her loyal tabby cat, was her only constant companion. Mornings began with the sound of water boiling for tea and ended with books resting on her lap, but no human voice filled the silence. Margaret had grown accustomed to the quiet, even though some days it hurt more than others. Despite her calm facade, her life bore scars. Decades earlier, difficult choices had distanced her from her children, leaving a void she could never fill. Margaret, once a passionate teacher, had become a woman with slow steps and a faraway gaze. She occupied herself with small rituals, feeding Charlie, watering her plants, and strolling through her neighborhood. Yet everything seemed to lack something, as if a piece of the puzzle had been lost forever. It was ironic that Margaret, who had spent her life teaching others to discover themselves, had become a stranger to herself. Sometimes she found herself looking out at Brooklyn's bustling streets, wondering if there was still a place for her out there. The few acquaintances who remained called her the cat lady, a label she accepted with a half smile but no enthusiasm. Nights were the hardest, filled with a silence even the TV couldn't break. Margaret feared admitting, even to herself, that she was haunted by abandonment. The abandonment of her children, her husband, and a life that seemed to have slipped through her fingers. Even on her busiest days, loneliness was a ghost she couldn't chase away. There was a hole in her heart that no hot tea or well-written book could fill. And yet, she pressed on, with the stubborn determination of someone who had survived so much. Her routine was almost mechanical, like a clock marking time without purpose. Margaret took daily walks to the subway station, where she watched people rushing by, carrying their lives in backpacks and anxious looks. It was like watching a movie in which she was never a character. She always returned home feeling the weight of the world but also a latent curiosity about what lay beyond her bubble of isolation. Though Margaret was lonely, she wasn't bitter. There was a flicker of hope in her heart, small but present, like a candle refusing to go out even when the wind blew hard. Perhaps that's why she still cared for Charlie with such devotion or placed fresh flowers in a vase on her windowsill. It was her way of resisting, of telling the world she was still there, even if no one seemed to notice. On rare occasions when she interacted with neighbors or strangers, Margaret exuded a quiet kindness that was no less powerful. She was the type of person who held the elevator door for someone or stopped to return a stranger's dropped change. These small gestures were her way of maintaining an invisible bridge to humanity. But deep down, she knew these moments didn't fill the emptiness she carried. The memories of her youth were like a warm blanket she pulled over herself on colder nights. She remembered when her children were young, their laughter filling the house, the holiday gatherings when everyone came together. These memories, though sweet, carried a bitter taste of something lost. It was as if her life had been split into two chapters, and the first had ended too soon. Sometimes, Margaret wondered if there would ever be a third chapter. Something inside her, an old intuition, told her there would be. But time seemed to crawl too slowly, and she feared that when the moment arrived, it might be too late. Yet, something was about to happen, something that would change everything. Of course, Margaret didn't know this. On that cold morning, as she wrapped a scarf around her neck and set out for her usual walk, she had no idea that fate was waiting. Margaret entered the subway station as she did every day, without expectation. The station was crowded as always, with hurried footsteps and fragmented voices echoing off the cold walls. She paused for a moment to adjust her scarf, and that's when she heard it, a fragile sound, almost lost in the commotion. A baby's cry. Her heart, long accustomed to silence, leaped. She looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but people rushed past, indifferent. The crying persisted, a plea for help that only she seemed to hear. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, Margaret followed the sound to an empty platform. And there he was, small and vulnerable, wrapped in a faded blanket. The baby was crying softly, his eyes closed as if the world was too overwhelming. Margaret felt a pang in her chest as she approached. Who could abandon a child like this? She looked around, hoping to see someone returning for the baby, but no one came. The scene was so surreal that it took her a moment to process what was in front of her. Looking closer, Margaret noticed something attached to the baby's tiny wrist, a plastic bracelet with the name Logan engraved on it. It was all he had, aside from the blanket. For a moment, she hesitated, her mind filled with doubts and fears. What could she, an elderly and lonely woman, do for this baby? Wouldn't it be wiser to call the authorities and let them handle it? But as she pondered, Logan opened his eyes. It was a pure, unguarded gaze that seemed to pierce through all the walls Margaret had built over the years. Without fully understanding why, Margaret picked Logan up. He was so small, so light, that he felt almost unreal. His crying stopped as soon as he felt the warmth of her arms, as if he knew he was safe. Margaret, on the other hand, felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of purpose. The fear was still there, like an unwelcome visitor, but there was also something new. Perhaps it was compassion. Or maybe it was the first glimmer of a love she didn't know she still had to give. Margaret didn't give herself time to overthink. She adjusted Logan in her arms, picked up the blanket, and began climbing the stairs out of the station. People stared curiously, but no one asked questions. When she reached the street, the winter cold enveloped her like a reminder of reality, but Margaret didn't turn back. She walked to her apartment, each step more resolute than the last. In that moment, she knew her life was changing, even though she had no idea how much. At home, Margaret improvised a crib with cushions and blankets while Logan slept soundly, exhausted from his own crying. She called social services, but the line was busy. It was almost as if the universe was conspiring to give her more time with the baby. Margaret sat beside him, studying every detail of his face. He was perfect, yet a mystery. Who was Logan? Why would someone leave him behind? As the baby slept, Margaret was flooded with memories. She thought of her own children, of the times she had cradled them when they were little. There was something familiar in the gesture, like an echo of who she had once been. But at the same time, reality asserted itself. Margaret was an elderly woman alone, with limited energy and resources. The fear of not being up to the task returned with full force, but she couldn't imagine handing Logan over to someone else. Throughout that night, Margaret barely slept. Each time Logan cried, she got up to soothe him. It wasn't easy. He seemed to demand more from her than anything else in her life. But at the same time, there was something almost magical about caring for him. Even in the most exhausting moments, Margaret felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Logan wasn't just an abandoned baby, he was a spark of something she didn't know still existed within her. The next morning, Margaret finally managed to contact Sarah, a young and kind social worker who promised to visit the apartment to talk. While she waited, Margaret tried to convince herself that she was just doing the right thing, taking care of the baby until someone more capable could take over. In the days that followed, Margaret's routine was turned upside down. Logan needed constant care, and Margaret, accustomed to slow and quiet days, felt overwhelmed by the whirlwind. The baby cried in the middle of the night, demanded attention at every moment, and brought out all the fears she had buried for years. What if she wasn't capable of caring for him? What if something went wrong? These questions echoed in her mind as she prepared bottles and changed diapers with trembling hands. Sarah's visits brought some relief. She was gentle but also very practical. She explained that Logan could be placed in an orphanage until a foster family was found. The idea weighed on Margaret like a stone. On the one hand, it seemed like the sensible thing to do. After all, she wasn't young anymore, and her health wasn't what it used to be. On the other hand, every moment with Logan made her more attached to him. He was so fragile, so dependent, that the thought of leaving him in unknown hands seemed unbearable. The dilemma consumed her. There were moments when Margaret found herself standing in the middle of the room, lost in thought. She imagined what Logan's life would be like without her, being raised by strangers. But she also thought about the impact he was having on her own life. The fear of failure was almost paralyzing. Charlie, the cat, seemed to sense her anguish and stayed close by, as if trying to comfort her. Margaret, however, knew this was a decision no one could make for her. One night, while Logan slept, Margaret finally broke down. Sitting on the living room floor, tears streaming down her face, she whispered to herself, "I can't do it. It's too much. I'm not capable." But deep down, she knew those words weren't entirely true. Something inside her, perhaps a strength she didn't know she still had, told her she could do this. That Logan needed her as much as she needed him. It was a terrifying and comforting thought at the same time. Margaret tried to think rationally. She made mental lists of the pros and cons of keeping Logan with her, but these lists never led to a clear conclusion. Her heart and mind seemed to be in constant battle. One day, she decided she would call Sarah and give Logan up. The next day, she felt a pang in her chest just imagining her home without the sound of the baby's cries. Each day was an emotional roller coaster that left her more exhausted than the sleepless nights. As the dilemma unfolded, Margaret began to notice something different. Logan, after just a few weeks under her care, seemed to be transforming her life. She no longer felt so lonely. There was a purpose to her days that she hadn't experienced in years. The physical exhaustion was great, but the emotional gratification was greater. Still, the fear lingered, like a shadow she couldn't completely dispel. The judgment of neighbors didn't help either. Some people in the building looked at Margaret with curiosity or disapproval, whispering about how an elderly woman could take on the responsibility of caring for a baby. These comments affected her more than she liked to admit. They reinforced her own fears and doubts, making the decision even harder. Margaret wanted to prove she was up to the task but feared they might be right. Sarah continued to insist that Margaret had the option of giving Logan to social services. She said it gently, but the idea always felt like an open wound. In one of these conversations, Margaret asked, "What if no one adopts him? What if he grows up feeling the abandonment as a scar that never heals?" Sarah tried to reassure her, but Margaret knew these questions had no easy answers. The world was cruel, and she couldn't bear the thought of Logan facing it alone. On a cold morning, Margaret decided to take a long walk with Logan. It was an ordinary day, but something inside her felt about to change. As she pushed the stroller through the streets of Brooklyn, she watched children playing in the parks and families laughing together. An unfamiliar feeling began to take shape. She still didn't have all the answers, but she knew she couldn't let fear decide for her. Something bigger was at stake, something that was beginning to grow inside her. Returning home, Margaret looked at Logan and felt warmth fill her chest. The baby opened his eyes and looked at her with that disarming purity. At that moment, something shifted. Margaret realized that maybe love wasn't about having all the answers but about being willing to try, even when it seemed impossible. She knew the next step would be crucial, but she was no longer willing to give up. Between bottles, diaper changes, and improvised lullabies, she began to see that she was learning as much as she was teaching. It was in this chaotic and mutual learning environment that Sarah, the social worker, became a constant presence. Young, energetic, and full of conviction, Sarah brought not only practical advice but also an unexpected dose of encouragement. Sarah saw something in Margaret that even she couldn't see. In every visit, she said something that planted seeds of confidence. "You have a gift for care, you know? Not everyone can do that." Margaret, initially reluctant, began to open up about her fears. She spoke about the abandonment she felt from her children, about her physical exhaustion, and about the constant doubt of not being enough for Logan. Sarah listened attentively, always offering words that seemed to carry more weight than simple consolation. On a particularly difficult afternoon, when Logan was feverish and Margaret was consumed by fear, Sarah appeared with a bag full of supplies and a calm smile. "He's going to be fine, Margaret. Trust what you feel. Love is the best compass there is." Those words stayed with Margaret for days. Sarah wasn't just helping her care for Logan. She was making her believe that love was enough to guide her decisions, even when the path seemed unclear. The connection between the two deepened. Sarah began sharing personal stories about growing up in the foster system and understanding the weight of abandonment. For Margaret, hearing this was both a blow and a lesson. She began to understand that her struggle wasn't just about Logan but about the opportunity to break a cycle of loneliness and rejection that seemed to haunt so many lives. Sarah became more than a social worker. She became an emotional mentor. Margaret realized that, little by little, she was gaining confidence. Sarah's words were like a mirror reflecting her abilities more clearly. She still had doubts, but now there was also something new, a spark of courage. Each small victory with Logan, a night without crying, an unexpected smile, reinforced that courage. And when Sarah handed her a book on infant care with a note saying, "Just trust yourself," Margaret understood that fear wasn't the enemy. The enemy was the doubt that she could be enough. The meetings with Sarah brought more than practical tips. They brought a new perspective. Margaret began revisiting old memories, no longer with sadness but with curiosity. She thought about the time she had raised her own children, the mistakes she had made, but also the love that always guided her actions. Sarah showed her, without directly saying it, that caring for Logan was an opportunity to rediscover her own strength. Over time, Margaret began to notice changes in herself. Her steps became firmer, and her voice more confident. When Logan was restless or sick, she no longer panicked. Instead, she took deep breaths, remembering Sarah's words, "You know what to do. You always have." There was something almost transformative in realizing that, without noticing, she was becoming the maternal figure Logan needed. But like all profound changes, this one also brought challenges. Sarah encouraged Margaret to think about the future and to plan for any complications that might arise. These conversations, though necessary, stirred Margaret's deepest fears. She knew there were still unanswered questions. Logan had a past she didn't know, a future she couldn't predict. Even so, Sarah's presence gave her a pillar to lean on, something she hadn't felt in years. On a rainy afternoon, as Sarah said goodbye after another visit, Margaret stood in the doorway watching her leave. She felt a deep gratitude but also an unease she couldn't ignore. She knew that despite the support, the real journey was just beginning. Years passed in the blink of an eye, and Logan, once a fragile baby in Margaret's arms, became a boy full of energy and curiosity. His laughter filled the corners of the apartment, transforming it into a vibrant home. Every step, every new word was a victory for Margaret, who saw in him a reflection of her own renewal. Logan loved hearing stories, especially the ones Margaret invented, where dragons and heroes always overcame challenges. She, in turn, felt that he was the greatest protagonist of her life. Margaret worked hard to give Logan a childhood full of experiences, even with limited resources. She took him to the park, taught him to care for plants, and helped him decorate the apartment with colorful drawings. But along with the joys came the challenges. As Logan grew older, he began asking questions Margaret didn't know how to answer. He wanted to know about his origins, about the mother and father who never appeared. "Am I special, Grandma?" he asked once. And although Margaret always responded with love, she felt the weight of the gaps she couldn't fill. Over time, Logan began to realize that his life was different from other children's. He saw parents accompanying friends to school and attending events, which sparked a restless curiosity. Margaret tried to protect him from these comparisons but knew she couldn't avoid these questions forever. There was a limit to how much she could fill the void of abandonment, and that realization haunted her. She wanted to be everything for Logan but knew he would need to seek his own answers someday. Difficulties began manifesting as small conflicts. Logan, now a preteen, sometimes acted irritated or rebellious, especially when Margaret set boundaries. "Why don't you trust me?" he challenged, leaving her in a mix of frustration and sadness. Margaret understood he was trying to find his identity, but her fear of losing him made her overly protective. After each argument, she questioned whether she was doing enough or repeating the same mistakes of the past. Despite the tensions, there were tender moments that reaffirmed their bond. Logan still snuggled beside Margaret on cold nights while she read to him. He made a point of helping with household chores, even if he complained occasionally. And on birthdays, he always prepared small handmade gifts like drawings or collages that expressed his gratitude. These moments were reminders that, despite the challenges, they were still a team, building something special. When Logan turned 13, Their relationship began to change more significantly. He wanted more freedom, more answers. Margaret, on the other hand, felt the world was too big and full of dangers to let him go so soon. On a particularly tense day, Logan exploded, "You're not my mom. Why are you trying to control my life?" The words hit Margaret like a blow, bringing her deepest fears to the surface. But instead of reacting with anger, she took a deep breath and tried to understand the pain behind his outburst. It was during this phase that Margaret realized she would need to find a balance between protecting Logan and allowing him to explore the world. She began to trust him more, even though each step of that trust was an emotional challenge. Logan, in turn, started seeing Margaret not just as an authority figure but as someone who, like him, was trying to find her place in the world. It was a delicate dance, full of stumbles but also moments that strengthened their bond. Adolescence brought Logan a whirlwind of emotions and questions he could no longer ignore. He loved Margaret deeply, but his desire to understand his origins grew every day. Friends at school asked innocent questions about his family, and Logan, unable to answer, began to feel a void that unsettled him. Margaret noticed this change and did her best to comfort him, but some things were beyond her reach. The sense of abandonment she had always feared seemed to shadow Logan invisibly. Logan began searching for answers on his own, rummaging through the few belongings Margaret had kept since the day she found him. The bracelet with his name engraved became an almost sacred object to him, a fragile link to a past he didn't know. Margaret noticed his more introspective behavior and tried to start conversations, but Logan avoided talking about how he really felt. To him, admitting the void felt like betraying the woman who had given him everything. During this time, Logan met Emily, a classmate who seemed to understand him in a way no one else could. Emily, with her practical outlook on life and a maturity that belied her age, became an indispensable friend. They spent hours talking about dreams, fears, and especially Logan's search for his roots. Emily didn't judge his doubts. Instead, she encouraged him to seek answers but also to value the present he had with Margaret. Margaret, on the other hand, watched the bond between them with mixed feelings. She was grateful that Logan had found someone he could open up to, but she also felt a pang of fear. What if this search for answers drove him away from her? Nights began to feel lonelier again, with Logan going out more often and spending less time at home. Margaret knew he was on a journey he needed to take alone, but that didn't make the process any less painful. Conflicts between Logan and Margaret started to arise more frequently. He wanted to know more about the day he was found, about why no one had come back for him. Margaret did her best to answer, but the truth was, she didn't have all the answers either. In a heated argument, Logan asked, "Didn't you ever want to know who left me there? Or were you okay hiding me from that past?" The question hit Margaret hard because she knew, in part, he was right. Despite the tensions, the love between them never faded. There were moments when Logan came home late but always made sure to apologize. Margaret, though hurt, waited for him with a cup of tea and a look of understanding. Amid the arguments, there were also gestures of mutual care, as if both knew that, deep down, they were fighting for the same love but in different ways. Each confrontation tested the bond they had built. Logan decided he needed to go in search of his answers. He started researching his origins, sending letters to institutions, and even looking for clues about who might have left the bracelet with his name. Emily supported him every step of the way but also warned him not to lose what he had with Margaret. "She's your family, Logan. Don't let your search take that away from you," Emily said. Logan knew she was right, but his need to understand his past was greater than he could control. As Logan delved deeper into his search, Margaret felt the distance growing. She tried to keep the house as welcoming as ever, but there was an increasing emptiness in the space. Logan spent more time away, and Margaret began to relive the loneliness she had felt before he came into her life. Even so, she knew she had to let him explore this path. Love, she realized, also meant giving freedom. One cold night, Logan finally had the courage to tell Margaret he was planning to leave home to continue his search for answers. "I need to understand who I am, Grandma," he said, tears in his eyes. Margaret held his hands and, despite the pain she felt, responded, "You will always be my grandson, Logan. No matter where your search takes you." It was a moment of deep connection but also of farewell. Logan left shortly after, leaving a vast emptiness in Margaret's life. She continued to receive letters and occasional messages from him, but his absence was palpable. However, amid the longing, Margaret found solace. Logan was searching for something she had always wished for him: a deeper understanding of himself. Logan's departure left Margaret's home in silence once again, but this time, the emptiness felt bigger. The contagious laughter and vibrant energy he brought were gone, leaving echoes of memories in every corner of the apartment. Margaret tried to fill her days with her old routines, caring for the plants, reading her books, observing Charlie. But without Logan, everything felt monotonous and purposeless. She told herself he needed this time to find himself, but the longing was almost unbearable. Logan, on the other hand, was living the whirlwind of his journey. He moved to a small town where he found a simple job, enough to pay the bills while continuing his search for answers. Though determined, there were moments when the loneliness hit hard. He remembered the warm nights beside Margaret, listening to her stories and feeling protected. But his desire to understand his roots drove him forward, even when fear and doubt surfaced. The letters between the two were a relief amid the distance. Logan wrote about his discoveries and challenges, while Margaret responded with words of support and advice filled with love. "Remember, you are more than your past, Logan. Don't let it define you completely," she wrote in one of the letters. Logan held onto those words as a mantra, but the unease of not knowing the truth still gnawed at him. He felt that each small discovery was a piece of a puzzle still far from complete. Despite the distance, Logan found constant support in Emily, who never let him face this search alone. She traveled to visit him whenever she could, bringing not just comfort but also perspectives that helped him stay focused. Have you thought that maybe what you're looking for isn't just about who left you but about who you want to be? Emily once asked, planting an idea Logan couldn't ignore. He knew his search wasn't just about the past but also about the future he wanted to build. While Logan faced these reflections, Margaret did her best not to succumb to loneliness. She started participating in book clubs in the neighborhood, meeting others who, like her, carried stories of loss and new beginnings. Though these activities brought moments of distraction, Margaret knew no company could replace the place Logan held in her heart. She kept each letter from him as a treasure, rereading them on silent nights and finding comfort in the thought that he still needed her, even from a distance. The longing, however, brought forth a constant worry. Margaret feared that the distance between them would become more than physical. What if Logan found the answers he was looking for and decided to move on without looking back? The thought haunted her, but she knew that true love wasn't about control. It was about allowing the other person to grow. It was a hard lesson, but one she was willing to learn for him. Logan began to uncover more concrete clues about his past. A social worker from an old institution responded to his inquiries, revealing that his biological mother had faced difficult circumstances and made the decision to leave him in the subway, hoping he would have a better life. This revelation brought a mix of emotions. Logan felt anger, sadness, but also an unexpected empathy. For the first time, he began to see his story of abandonment in a different light. Even with this new information, Logan felt something was still missing. He needed closure, something that explained not just the events but also the reasons behind them. Margaret, reading about this new discovery in one of his letters, felt a pang in her chest. She knew these answers were important to Logan but feared that, in the process, he might lose himself emotionally. Even so, she continued to encourage him, reminding him that his journey was also an opportunity to reconnect with himself. As the months passed, Logan felt he was getting closer to something significant, though he still didn't know what. It was as if each step brought him closer to a truth that both attracted and scared him. He began to realize that his search for origins wasn't just about understanding the past but also about discovering what he wanted to carry into the future. Then, something unexpected happened. The news came like a lightning bolt on a cloudy day, devastating. Margaret received a phone call that left her reeling. Logan was hospitalized. He had collapsed at work, and doctors discovered a severe heart condition requiring an urgent transplant. Margaret felt the world spinning around her as she listened to the details. The distance between her and Logan had never felt so cruel. He needed her, and she couldn't be by his side immediately. Fear mixed with helplessness as she wondered what to do. Logan, meanwhile, lay in a hospital bed, processing the gravity of his situation. His search for answers had been abruptly interrupted, and now he faced a real threat to his life. Emily was there, holding his hand and trying to stay calm, but Logan felt the weight of uncertainty. He thought of Margaret constantly, worried about how she would handle the news. Despite her apparent strength, he knew she also carried her own vulnerabilities. Margaret wasted no time. Despite her frail health and physical challenges, she arranged everything to travel and be with Logan. During the journey, her heart ached, but she also filled with determination. "He needs me now more than ever," she repeated to herself like a mantra. Upon arriving at the hospital, she found Logan pale but smiling, trying to mask his worry. They embraced tightly, as if that gesture could dispel the fear lingering between them. The following days were an emotional roller coaster. Margaret stayed by Logan's side as much as possible while doctors explained the complexities of the situation. He needed a compatible donor, but the chances of finding someone were uncertain. Margaret volunteered to undergo tests, but her age and health made her ineligible. This fact devastated her. For the first time, she felt the weight of her age as a real barrier to protecting the one she loved. Logan tried to reassure her, but she saw the same fear reflected in his eyes. As they waited for answers, Margaret resumed being the pillar of strength she had always been for Logan. She read to him, told him stories from her childhood, and did everything she could to keep the atmosphere light, even though she was falling apart inside. Emily, who never left Logan's side, became an indispensable ally for Margaret. The two worked together to keep Logan hopeful while exploring ways to expedite the process of finding a donor. However, the situation grew increasingly heavy. Logan had anxiety attacks, and Margaret did her best to calm him. One difficult night, he looked at Margaret and said, "I don't want to leave you, Grandma." She held his hand tightly and replied, "You won't. We'll get through this together as we always have." But even as she spoke those words, the fear of losing him consumed her. Meanwhile, Emily mobilized to search for potential donors. She contacted support groups and transplant registries, refusing to accept that Logan would be left without options. Her determination inspired both Margaret and Logan, who saw in her a quiet but powerful strength. With each new piece of information, Margaret felt a mix of hope and despair. The answers always seemed just out of reach, as if the universe was testing her faith. It was during this crisis that a miracle began to unfold. During one of her searches, Emily found a lead on the possible whereabouts of Logan's biological father, Michael. Margaret could hardly believe it when she heard the name again after so many years. To her, Michael was a shadow of the past, someone who had never been present and who, until that moment, didn't seem part of Logan's story. But now, he might be their only hope. With this information, Margaret and Emily began searching for Michael. It was a race against time, and Margaret knew convincing Michael to help would be a challenge. At the same time, she felt that fate had placed this piece on the board for a reason. While they waited for a response, Margaret remained by Logan's side, holding his hand and promising everything would be okay, even when she didn't know if it would. The days in the hospital were long and exhausting, but Margaret never gave up hope. Logan, despite everything, maintained an inner strength that inspired everyone around him. Each smile he gave, even amidst the pain, was a reminder to Margaret that the love they shared was stronger than any obstacle. But the clock continued to tick, and Margaret knew time was running out. On a gray morning, Margaret received a phone call that changed everything. On the other end of the line, a male voice sounded hesitant but determined. "My name is Michael. I understand Logan needs help, and I think I can be of assistance." Margaret nearly dropped the phone. The man she believed was gone, who had disappeared entirely from her life decades ago, was alive. More than that, he seemed willing to do something she never imagined: save Logan's life. Margaret took a few minutes to catch her breath and process what she had just heard. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "Do you know what you're saying? He's your son. This is real?" Michael confirmed, explaining that he hadn't known of Logan's existence until recently, when Emily found him. He was willing to undergo all necessary tests and even become the donor if he was compatible. For him, it was a chance to make amends for a past full of mistakes. The reunion between Margaret and Michael at the hospital was filled with restrained emotions. Both carried old wounds, but the urgency of the situation didn't allow those feelings to take over. Michael, a man marked by time, carried a mix of regret and determination in his eyes. Margaret, though still wary, decided to put Logan's well-being above everything else. The focus now was singular: save Logan's life. Logan, upon learning of the existence of his biological father, was initially in shock. He didn't know how to react to Michael's presence, but over time, he began to accept the idea. There was something sincere in Michael's eyes that Logan couldn't ignore. Conversations between the two started timidly but soon evolved into moments of genuine connection. Michael shared stories from his youth, and for the first time, Logan felt that perhaps he could fill some of the gaps that had haunted him. While tests were conducted, Michael spent more time with Logan and Margaret. He was there to stay, regardless of what happened. "If there's one thing I can do to fix the past, it's this," he told Margaret during a private conversation. The test results finally arrived. Michael was a match. The news brought a mix of relief and fear for everyone. The procedure would be risky, both for Logan and for Michael, but there was no other choice. Michael insisted on moving forward, even knowing the dangers. "I wasn't there when he needed me most, but now I can be. And that's all that matters to me," he declared with a firmness that moved Margaret. The night before the surgery, the three gathered in Logan's hospital room. The atmosphere was heavy with silence, but also with a connection words couldn't describe. Michael held Logan's hand and said, "You're stronger than I ever was. This is just the beginning for you." Logan, tears in his eyes, replied, "Thank you for being here. For trying." Margaret watched the scene with a heavy but hopeful heart. Everything she had endured, all the love she had given to Logan, finally seemed to find a larger purpose. The day of the surgery arrived, and the hospital felt colder and quieter than ever. Margaret and Emily waited anxiously as the doctors prepared for the procedure. Time seemed to drag, each second a reminder of the uncertainty of the future. For Margaret, all she could do was pray, not for a miracle, but for strength, for Logan, for Michael, and for herself. Whatever came next, she knew their lives would never be the same. After hours of tension, the surgeon finally appeared. The surgery was a success. The words echoed in Margaret's ears like music. She collapsed into the chair, tears streaming down her face. Emily held her hand, sharing that moment of relief. The days following the surgery brought a mix of relief and uncertainty. Logan was recovering well, and Michael, though still weak, seemed determined to use every moment as an opportunity to rebuild the bonds they had never had the chance to create. However, unanswered questions lingered, questions Margaret and Logan knew they would eventually need to face. Michael's story, his absence, and the reasons behind his abandonment were like shadows everyone feared confronting. One quiet afternoon in the hospital, Michael finally asked to speak with Margaret and Logan together. He seemed paler than usual, but there was a firmness in his voice that showed he was ready to face the past. "I owe you both an explanation," he began, looking directly at Logan. "I never knew you existed. Your mother made that decision on her own, and only now do I understand why." Logan met Michael's gaze, eager for the answers he had always sought. Michael recounted the story of his relationship with Logan's mother. They were young, in love, but also trapped in a cycle of instability and conflict. He admitted that at the time, he wasn't a man ready to start a family. "I was immature, irresponsible, and didn't understand what it meant to care for someone other than myself," he confessed, his eyes filled with tears. When Logan's mother realized he couldn't provide the security she needed, she disappeared, taking the secret of her pregnancy with her. Margaret, who had always had her own theories, remained silent as she listened to the story. Her mind revisited the years she spent raising Logan alone, trying to fill the gaps that were now starting to be filled. She felt anger, of course, but also a strange compassion. Michael wasn't the man she had expected to meet, but there was something genuine in his pain and regret. Logan, on the other hand, struggled to process everything. He had fantasized about the day he would meet his father, imagining scenarios ranging from furious confrontations to emotional embraces. But reality was more complicated. Michael's vulnerability disarmed him, and for the first time, Logan began to see the man behind the abandonment. "I can't change the past," Michael said, his voice trembling. "But I want to be part of your future, if you'll let me." Michael's words touched a sensitive spot in Logan. He knew forgiveness wasn't an immediate process, but he also knew the man in front of him was trying. Margaret, who had always been a silent mediator between the two, finally intervened. "Logan, you don't have to decide everything now. Time will help you both figure out how you fit into each other's lives." Her voice was firm but carried the wisdom of someone who understood the challenges of forgiveness. In the days that followed, Logan and Michael began spending more time together, exploring the delicate terrain of a relationship still under construction. Michael spoke of his past mistakes, while Logan shared stories of his childhood with Margaret. These moments, though small, created a bridge between them. Margaret watched from a distance, feeling both relieved and exhausted. The role of protector had always been her burden and her joy, but now she felt she could finally share that weight. Michael also found time to speak with Margaret alone. He thanked her for everything she had done for Logan, acknowledging that she had been much more than a grandmother. "You were his mother, his father, everything he needed. And I can never repay that." Margaret, who had always avoided praise, replied with a slight smile. "I didn't do it for recognition, Michael. I did it because love never gave me another choice." There was a silent understanding between them, as if they both knew they were beginning to heal old wounds. Logan, though still carrying hurts, began to realize something important. His identity wasn't solely in the answers he sought but also in the connections he was building. He didn't need to choose between the past and the present, between Margaret and Michael. Each of them was part of who he was, and together, they formed a story still being written. This realization brought a relief he hadn't expected. The months following the surgery brought profound changes in the dynamic between Logan, Margaret, and Michael. Margaret's apartment, once marked by loneliness, now pulsed with conversations, occasional laughter, and a sense of home she hadn't felt in years. Logan was still recovering but slowly regaining his vitality. He worked hard to rebuild his physical strength while also facing the emotional weight of recent revelations. Michael, on the other hand, was no longer a ghost of the past. He was present, willing to rebuild ties and face the consequences of his absence. The conversations between Margaret and Michael grew deeper. They revisited the past, not to place blame but to understand how they had reached this point. Michael shared more about the years he had been absent, the wrong choices he made, and the regrets that had followed him. Margaret, in turn, spoke of the fear she felt raising Logan alone, of the nights she cried silently, wondering what the future would hold. These exchanges, though painful, began to heal wounds neither of them realized they still carried. Logan, meanwhile, was learning to balance his relationship with Margaret and Michael. He knew Margaret was his foundation, the person who had always been by his side, even in the hardest moments. But over time, he began to see Michael not just as the man who had been absent but as someone trying to be better. This shift in perspective didn't happen overnight but was strengthened by small gestures. An honest conversation, a moment of support, a simple "I'm here." As time passed, the three began to find a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Logan, watching the interaction between Margaret and Michael, began to understand something important. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past but about creating a new present. He knew there was still much to resolve, but he felt he was on the right path. Margaret, for her part, felt lighter, as if a weight she had carried for years was finally lifting. One sunny afternoon, while the three of them were at the park, Logan looked at Margaret and Michael and said, "I never thought this was possible. Thank you for not giving up on me." It was a simple moment but loaded with meaning. Margaret felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Everything she had endured, all the love she had poured into Logan, finally seemed to find a greater purpose. The family's reconnection didn't erase the challenges, but it brought something more powerful: hope. Margaret, Logan, and Michael were building a future together, rooted in painful truths but also in a strength only love and forgiveness could provide. And though the road ahead was long, every step taken together was a victory. Over time, Margaret realized her journey wasn't just about raising Logan. It was also about rediscovering herself, finding strength where she thought there was only emptiness. She knew love hadn't healed everything but had shown the way. And that, in itself, was enough to transform her life. On a starry night, as Margaret gazed out her bedroom window, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. Logan was in the room next door, Michael was in the living room reading a book, and Charlie the cat was sleeping at her feet. For the first time, Margaret wasn't thinking about what she had lost or feared losing. She was living in the present, surrounded by love, and ready for whatever the future might bring.